let's step back a bit for a bit of context here. How is this any different from the bond notes idea from 2016, because that was backed by, I think it was a $200 million loan from the Afrexim Bank, or the gold-backed digital currency that the central bank rolled out in May last year?
So with the bond note, for example, it was not introduced as a full-fledged currency. It was introduced as an export incentive. Of course, later on, it then evolved into the local currency. Then also with the digital gold tokens, they were largely introduced as an alternative store of value and not necessarily for transactionary purposes. So even the uptake was largely by the institutional investors, almost about 80%, and about 20% was taken up by the individuals. So the ZiG now is a full-fledged local currency. Obviously, that is backed by foreign exchange reserves as well as gold reserves. So that's the key difference there, that this is a full-fledged currency that's going to replace the now defunct Zimbabwe dollar.
So walk us through the mix of assets that essentially was picked to back this new currency. They've spoken about gold, they've spoken about the foreign currency reserves, but what else is there to essentially provide a bit of support to the currency? And when they say it's backed by, are we looking at a hard liquidity limit, almost similar to what the gold standard we used to work like?
Yeah, definitely. It's a hard liquidity constraint or budgetary constraint, if you want, in the sense that the reserve money in circulation will actually be determined by the reserves, both the gold reserves and the US dollar reserves that we actually have within the central bank. So that will actually anchor, that should help to anchor probably the value of the ZiG. But I'm not sure that the reserves are adequate, because according to the SADC macroeconomic convergence criteria, we need at least 6 months import cover, which equates our average imports per month are around 700 million. So 6-month import cover would equate to almost about 4.2 billion USD. So you can compare that with about 285 million in terms of the total reserves that we actually have to anchor the ZiG. But ultimately, it's the sustainability of any currency, obviously, is a function of confidence. It's also a function of what's happening in terms of inflationary developments. And in terms of confidence, we've had serious challenges. There's a huge deficit of confidence, not just in the local currency, but also even in the institution managing that local currency. So I think that's going to be, of course, building that confidence is going to entail sticking to some of the proposals that the central bank has actually unveiled with respect to issues of fiscal and monetary discipline going forward. I think that's going to be very, very critical, because as long as we are able to control, especially money, unsustainable growth in money supply and unbudgeted for fiscal expenditures, I think that's going to help to sustain the ZiG.
Which is why the central bank governor was saying, to paraphrase what he said in the press conference today, I'm not here to do anyone else's job, in reference, of course, to quasi-fiscal operations by the central bank. Let's take this argument from a different tack, though. Roughly 80-ish% of transactions in the country are in some way done in the US dollar or made with reference to the US dollar at this point. So
it's probably more than that now. Yeah.
Indeed. So why wasn't dollarization not a palatable option for the central bank and the finance ministry? I know one of the answers they might say is, look, we don't want to give up monetary independence. But at the end of the day, that seems to be the one option that businesses and households have seemed to adapt to.
Yeah, that's obviously one of the options. Of course, government had already said that they were not going to go that route, because it has implications. When you fully dollarize, it means you have to convert all the local currency balances into USD. So that involves obviously a bit of that would require some huge cash injection to do that, which cash the government probably doesn't have. And also the fact that you actually lose the effectiveness of monetary policy as a tool to influence macroeconomic and monetary aggregates. So I think those are some of the considerations that they actually took into account in maintaining this multiple currency regime. So it's actually a transition to probably full dollarization, because we've been told that until 2030, we're probably going to be in this multiple currency regime. So that, I think, provides a bit of certainty to economic agents with respect to the issue of the currency. But I think now the challenge is to ensure that we are able to sustain the value of the local currency, so at least that de-dollarization process will run on course and will be a market-determined process and not necessarily a government-decreed process.
Right. You've actually touched on something that I want to wrap up with, the mechanics of exactly how this works. So for the layman, how does this work? You wake up tomorrow, you've got the Zimbabwean dollars that you had in your accounts have all now been converted into ZiG, and what sort of conversion rate will apply? Do we have any details on that?
Yeah. So the conversion rate, the opening conversion rate is about 13 ZiG to 1 USD. So it's ultimately determined by the interbank rate. So we still have an interbank rate for foreign exchange determination, and also the value of the gold. So those are the two variables that will determine the ZiG exchange rate.